Welcome to a world that once fell silent. It's the year 1350. The bells of Europe have stopped ringing. There are simply too few hands left to ring them. Fields once golden with wheat now lie quiet, the air heavy with loss and uncertainty. But out of that silence, something began to stir. Tonight, we're not just talking about history. We're stepping into the shoes of those who survived the greatest tragedy the world had ever seen, the Black Death. And together, we'll discover what life looked like after the plague, how humanity rebuilt, how hope returned, one heartbeat at a time. So, if you're listening right now, maybe lying in bed, eyes half closed, let your mind drift. Breathe slowly. And as we journey through the ruins and rebirth of the 14th century, let the rhythm of this story guide you toward rest. If you enjoy stories that bring history to life softly, vividly, truthfully, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep creating long, immersive journeys through time. Stories that whisper the past back to life, even as the world outside grows quiet. Now, let's begin with the moment the world stopped breathing. As the last echoes of the bells fade into the wind, the story truly begins not with peace, but with whispers. Whispers that drifted across mountains and seas, carried by merchants, sailors, and the unseen. Whispers that spoke of a sickness, one that didn't just take lives, but reshaped the very rhythm of the world. As the last echoes of the bells fade into the wind, the story truly begins not with peace, but with whispers. Whispers that drifted across mountains and seas, carried by merchants, sailors, and the unseen. Whispers that spoke of a sickness, one that didn't just take lives, but reshaped the very rhythm of the world. When the world stopped breathing, it started far from Europe, somewhere in the high plateaus of Central Asia, around the 1,330 seconds. There, amid trade routes that connected east and west, a tiny bacterium, Yersinia pestis, began its quiet journey. It lived in the blood of wild rodents, spread by the bites of fleas. No one knew its name, no one could see it. But in time, it would kill more than 75 million people across continents, perhaps even half of Europe's population. Merchants travelled the Silk Road, caravans carried silk, spices, and silver, and hidden within their cargo, the plague travelled too. By 1346, the first outbreaks appeared near the Black Sea in the bustling city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading outpost. According to chroniclers, Mongol soldiers besieging the city began to fall ill, and in desperation, they catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. The defenders fled, and with them, the Black Death sailed westward. In October 1347, 12 trading ships arrived in Sicily, at the port of Messina. What the dock workers found was beyond comprehension. Most of the sailors were already dead. The rest were dying, blackened boils covering their bodies. Within days, the sickness spread through the port, and from there, like wildfire along Europe's veins of trade, it moved north to Italy, France, Spain, England. No one understood what was happening. People called it the pestilence, the great mortality, the hand of God. Some said it came through the air, others blamed the alignment of the planets, and many turned to the church, begging for mercy, for meaning, for anything. The symptoms came fast and cruel. First, a fever. Then, pain so deep it felt like the bones were burning. Black swellings, buboes formed under the arms, in the groin, at the neck. They oozed and burst, the stench unbearable. People coughed blood, their skin turning ashen and black. And death came within days, sometimes hours. In Florence, one chronicler wrote that mothers abandoned their children, gravediggers refused to handle the dead, and priests, the shepherds of souls, fled their flocks. Giovanni Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, described it simply: brother abandoned brother, father left child, and none could be found to bury the dead for love or money. In some towns, half the population was gone in a single year. London lost tens of thousands. Paris was emptied of scholars and merchants. And in the countryside, entire villages disappeared, swallowed by weeds and silence. Travellers passed by hamlets where doors swung open to houses with no one left inside. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock wandered free, and the night was filled only with the sound of crows. It was, as some later said, the time when the world stopped breathing. No wars, no politics, no faith could shield anyone. Rich and poor died the same. Kings fell sick in their castles, peasants died in the mud. Trade halted. Ships were left adrift at sea, with no living crew to dock them. And across Europe, The smell of smoke and death filled the air, as people burned incense, herbs, even entire homes, believing fire could drive the plague away. But the terror did not end quickly. Wave after wave returned over decades: 1,361, 1,369, 1,375. Each outbreak smaller, but each a reminder that the plague was never truly gone. It would linger for centuries, revisiting towns, reshaping lives, forcing humanity to adapt. For those who survived, survival itself felt like a curse and a miracle. They emerged into a world unrecognizable, quieter, emptier, yet strangely new. With so many dead, the very structure of society began to shift. Labor became scarce, land plentiful, and the balance of power between lord and serf, rich and poor, began to tilt. The old world had died with the plague carts, and from its ashes, a new one was waiting to be born. So tonight, as you listen, picture those early survivors, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, standing in streets where the wind carried no laughter, only memory. They did not yet know it, but they stood at the threshold of change, a change that would shape everything to come: economy, faith, art, and the human heart itself. The Black Death was not just a tragedy. It was the great reset of an entire civilization. And as the plague's shadow began to fade, Europe would learn, slowly and painfully, what it meant to live again. The carts have stopped rolling, the fires have gone out. But in the silence that follows, Europe holds its breath, as though afraid that even a whisper might wake death again. For those who lived through it, the world no longer made sense. The faces they knew, the sounds of laughter and church bells gone, and in their place, only the echo of what once was. This was not recovery, it was reckoning, and for the first time, humanity began to count not its riches, but its losses, counting the missing. In the spring of 1351, after the worst had passed, the chronicler Jean Froissart wrote from France. The world seemed empty. One could ride a whole day without seeing a living soul. That was not exaggeration. Entire villages vanished. In England, tax rolls reveal a collapse so complete that whole counties lost up to 60% of their population. In Tuscany, the historian Matteo Villani wrote of Florence. Out of every 5, 4 were dead. The rich, the poor, the priest, and the beggar all fell alike. And he had reason to know his own brother, Giovanni Villani, one of the greatest historians of Florence, died of the plague while writing his chronicle. Matteo picked up his pen to finish it, alone in a silent city. The numbers are staggering. Florence lost more than half its inhabitants, perhaps 60,000 souls. Venice, once home to over 100,000, saw its population fall by 70%. In London, so many died that entire parishes ceased to exist. Chroniclers in France wrote that death filled the air like smoke. But beyond the numbers, the silence itself became unbearable. In towns where once 1,000 voices rose at dawn, now the only sound was wind through shutters. Writers from the time said even the birds grew quiet, as if nature itself were in mourning. In Siena, the painter Ambrogio Lorenzetti, famed for his mural The Allegory of Good Government, fell ill and died before finishing his next commission. The city buried him quickly and shut the workshop doors. His paints dried on the wall, the colours fading like the lives that once filled his streets. For the survivors, art, song, and laughter became foreign things. One Florentine merchant wrote in his diary, "I have no one left to trade with, no one left to talk to. I am the last man in my street." It was not just people who vanished. It was community, connection, memory, whole generations erased from history, leaving only blank pages where their names should have been. The geography of absence. From England to Hungary, maps began to lie. They still showed towns that no longer existed. Travellers spoke of fields where the roads had disappeared under weeds, and of churches whose doors hung open. The altar candles burned down to pools of wax that no hand would clean. In France, King Philip VI ordered a census of the living, but the clerks he sent often died before finishing their lists. In Germany, parish records stopped abruptly in 1349, then resumed years later with new, shaky handwriting. A new priest. A new generation, trying to start again. Letters from the period reveal the same bewildered tone. The poet Petrarch wrote to his brother Gerardo, a monk who survived the plague. "How many friends have I buried? The world is empty, and I am weary of life." He ends the letter simply, We are the remnants of a people, the ruins of mankind. Oh, one. Imagine living in a world where you could walk from village to village, and each one was silent. No market noise, no children's laughter, no dogs barking. Only the whisper of wind across the grass where people once stood. That was Europe in 1351, a civilization breathing shallowly, unsure if it still wanted to live. For those who lived, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like guilt, a guilt so heavy that some could not bear to speak of it. Letters from the years after the plague often read like confessions. One surviving monk from Avignon wrote, "I have buried every brother of my order. I alone remain. Each day I ask God why." That question, why me, echoed across a continent. From London to Prague, the survivors shared one thing: silence. No one dared to speak too loudly of the dead, for fear that the plague might hear and return. The weight of survival. Imagine a woman in Florence, 1351. She steps out of her house, her husband gone, her children gone, her neighbours gone. The market square where she once bought bread now echoes with crows. The baker's stall is empty. The cloth merchant's door hangs open. She holds a small loaf in her hand, baked for no one. She doesn't cry anymore. The tears have long since dried. She simply stands there, listening to the silence of a city that no longer knows her name. That woman could have been any of thousands. Across Europe, grief became too vast to express, so people stopped trying. Chroniclers wrote that there was no mourning, for mourning had lost its meaning. Death had become too familiar, too constant, like the weather or the turning of the seasons. Even art turned silent. Before the plague, Europe's paintings celebrated heaven and saints, golden halos, and divine triumphs. After the plague, the imagery changed. The dance macabre, the dance of death, began to appear on church walls, skeletons leading kings and peasants hand in hand. It was not blasphemy, it was the truth. Death had become the one companion that never left. Letters from the lost. From the city of Avignon, where the Pope had fled the plague, survivors wrote letters that sound less like prayers and more like cries in the dark. The scholar Louis Sanctus wrote, "All the world is dying, and I, though living, am dead. I." And in another letter, dated 1352, a widow in northern France wrote to her brother, "The world has gone quiet. Even the birds will not sing. I wish I could join those I have lost. To live now is to live among ghosts." No one replied to her letter. Her brother had died months earlier. The letter was found, years later, sealed, in the archives of Rouen. Across Europe, such fragments survive. Letters never delivered, wills unsigned, prayers half finished. They are the voices of a generation that could not find an audience. The vanishing of faith. For centuries, the church had been the anchor of European life. But when priests died as fast as peasants, and prayers brought no protection, many began to doubt. Some turned fanatical, the flagellants, who roamed the countryside whipping themselves, believing their suffering could save the world. They filled town squares with the sound of chains and hymns, until the church itself, fearing chaos, condemned them. Others simply walked away from faith entirely. Petrarch again wrote, "The priests are silent, the bells do not ring, and I no longer know where God is hiding." In some places, villagers buried their dead without ceremony, without candles, without priests, only a prayer whispered to the wind. Funerals became too dangerous, too many, too endless. A chronicler from Cologne noted, "In the end, we ceased to toll the bells, for there were none left to hear them." The survivors were not just few. They were broken in faith, in spirit, in meaning. And yet, paradoxically, they were also free in ways no generation before them had been. But that freedom, the power to live after death, would come at a cost. The years that followed were years of disorientation. Europe had not only lost its people, it had lost its rhythm. Everyday life, the simple order of dawn and market, work and prayer, had collapsed. The survivors walked through empty streets not knowing what came next. The old world had died, and no one had taught them how to live in the new one. In England, the writer Henry Knighton observed, "Men were few, women fewer, and labourers rare beyond measure. None could remember a time when silence was so great upon the land." The silence was not just physical, it was emotional. People feared one another. Neighbours avoided eye contact. The memory of infection lingered in every touch, every breath. A farmer from Norfolk wrote in a surviving account, "When I see a man upon the road, I cross the field to avoid him, for who knows what he carries." And so, Europe became a land of distance, not of geography, but of the human heart. The shrunken world. Before the plague, the world had felt wide merchants, scholars, and pilgrims moving between cities and kingdoms. But after, travel ceased. Roads grew wild, inns closed, bridges collapsed from neglect. People retreated into smaller circles, villages, families, a handful of survivors clinging together. Their world had shrunk to the horizon of what they could walk in a day. This isolation bred both fear and a strange intimacy. Communities that survived became close-knit, bound by shared loss. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the dead still lingered nearby, listening. Some rebuilt together, others simply waited, staring at the empty road that once brought strangers and stories. Chroniclers noted a change in language itself. Where people once said, "we," they now said, "I." A subtle shift, but one that echoed across generations. A merchant in Lübeck wrote, "We do not trust as we once did. We keep our hands to ourselves, our doors closed. The heart has become a locked chest." The fear of the living. Fear had once belonged to death. Now it belonged to life itself. People feared gatherings, strangers, even family. In Paris, survivors were said to cross the street rather than share a shadow. In Germany, entire markets stayed closed for years after the plague, not by law, but by memory. No one wanted to stand where the sick had fallen. The playwright Robert of Reading wrote, "When we see a crowd, we see a grave." And in that fear, the habits of civilization shifted. The handshake, once a symbol of trust, nearly vanished. People spoke from a distance, bowed instead of embraced. Houses were built farther apart, villages spaced wider. It was as if humanity had learned to breathe alone. The new silence. The historian Barbara Tuchman later called it the silence after the storm. But to those who lived through it, it was not silence, it was the sound of memory trying to fade. In the ruined monasteries, birds nested in the rafters where choirs once sang. In Florence, grass grew between the stones of the piazza. In the English countryside, churches stood half empty, even on holy days. Some survivors spoke of hearing voices, not madness, but memory. A woman in Lübeck claimed she could still hear her children playing in the courtyard long after they were gone. An old priest in Avignon said he dreamed of the same sermon every night, the one he never got to finish before his parish died. Europe had become haunted, not by ghosts, but by echoes, the sound of everything that was once familiar and would never return. But from this stillness, something unexpected would emerge. The survivors, weary, scarred, isolated, would begin to build again. Not the same world, but a smaller one. One shaped by caution, by memory, and by the quiet determination to keep living, no matter how empty the world had become. In time, the stillness began to soften. Not all at once, it was gradual, like dawn creeping across the ruins of night. The same Europe that had fallen silent began to hum again, quietly at first. A murmur of tools, of voices, of life rediscovering itself. No one called it rebirth. They did not yet know they were rebuilding civilization. They were simply trying to live. The return of hands. In the market squares that had once been deserted, people began to meet again. Timid at first, standing apart, speaking little, then closer, braver. The first baker reopened his stall in Florence. The smell of bread drifted through streets that had forgotten warmth. A woman passing by stopped, closed her eyes, and wept. In Norwich, records show a shoemaker reopening his shop in 1353. His name was William Dean. He wrote in the town ledger, "I make shoes again, though for fewer feet." Those small gestures were acts of defiance against oblivion. Each hammer strike, each loaf baked, each child's cry that broke the silence was a declaration. We are still here. Neighbours began to talk again. Hands that had once withdrawn reached out, not in greeting yet, but in help. They built new roofs, tilled new fields, tended graves together. And in those simple labours, the pulse of community returned. The seeds of compassion. Before the plague, life had been rigid nobles above peasants, priests above all. But death had made everyone equal. When the rich and poor had fallen side by side, something changed in the heart of Europe. Chroniclers wrote that charity increased. Orphans were taken in by strangers. Farmers left food on the road for travellers. Hospitals, once rare, began to appear in greater numbers, often founded by survivors who swore to serve the sick. A woman named Agnes de Calais, who lost her husband and sons, sold her estate to fund a shelter for widows. In her will, she wrote, "I have nothing left to love but mercy. It was a new kind of piety, quieter, humbler, born from shared loss rather than fear of damnation. The people who had once prayed for salvation now prayed for comfort. And in that shift, the roots of compassion deepened. Art after silence. From the ashes of despair, art found a new voice. Painters and poets began to depict not just saints and kings, but the human condition itself, grief, tenderness, impermanence. In Florence, the painter Bartolo di Freddi depicted mourners holding one another, faces weary but alive. In France, manuscript illuminators filled the margins of their texts with flowers growing around skulls. Beauty and death forever entwined. Music, too, returned slower, gentler. Monks who once chanted psalms of judgment now sang hymns of remembrance. A Benedictine text from 1354 reads, "We sing for those who cannot, that their silence may find peace." Art became an act of healing, a way for the living to speak the words the dead never could. A smaller, kinder world. And so, out of devastation, Europe became something new, smaller, more cautious, but also more tender. The survivors had learned the fragility of existence, and that lesson reshaped everything. Families cherished one another more deeply. Time was no longer taken for granted. Even laughter, when it returned, felt sacred. In London, one chronicler noted, "We laugh as those who have seen the end of laughter." That laughter, quiet, trembling, but real, was the sound of rebirth. Not triumph, not glory, but resilience. The kind of strength that whispers rather than shouts. And as generations passed, the memory of the plague became both wound and teacher. It reminded humanity that life was fleeting, that love mattered, and that even in ruin, the human spirit endures. The world had counted its missing. Now, it began gently to count the living again. The world that survived the plague was a different one. It was quieter, more wary, and yet strangely full of possibility. The old world of castles and kingdoms, of nobles and serfs, was fading. In its place was a new world, built by the hands of those who had lived to see it, and those who, having lost everything, now had nothing to lose. The new labourers. When the plague took its toll, it didn't just steal lives, it also changed the very fabric of society. In 1349, after the worst of the pandemic had passed, Europe was left with a gaping wound in its workforce. It was estimated that as much as half of the population had perished, and with so many dead, the few who remained suddenly found themselves in great demand. Farmers, craftsmen, and labourers, once the invisible backbone of society, now held the power. The labour force had dwindled, and with it, the social order began to unravel. In many places, wages for workers doubled, and sometimes even tripled, as they were no longer at the mercy of the aristocracy. A chronicler from England, William of Malmesbury, recorded the transformation. The serf had never been as free as he was now. With the nobility gone, he owned his labour as he had never done before. But this new freedom was not without its challenges. While peasants had more bargaining power than ever before, many of the old feudal obligations remained. Landlords and lords tried to rein in the workers' newfound autonomy, and in some regions, laws were enacted to limit wages and prevent workers from leaving their lands. These laws, like England's Ordinance of Labourers, were an attempt to preserve the old order, but they met fierce resistance. In some places, workers simply refused to return to the fields or to work in the same conditions as before. This rejection of old servitude was perhaps one of the most profound shifts in post-plague Europe. The idea that a man could sell his labour, rather than simply give it to a lord, was an idea that had long been suppressed, but now it has begun to take root. The religious shift. With so many dead, and with no one left to lead them, people began to question their faith. The church, once a symbol of absolute authority, now found itself fractured. Priests, monks, and nuns, once the steady hands that guided the souls of the living, had perished, along with their followers. In some towns, the number of clergy had been reduced by over half. Many parishes went without priests for months, sometimes years. The flagellants, a religious movement that emerged after the plague, symbolized the shift in religious thought. These men and women believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and that they could atone for the world's sins by whipping themselves in public. The movement grew rapidly, attracting thousands of followers, but it was eventually condemned by the church for its excesses. The Black Death also led to a rise in skepticism. In Italy, the poet Petrarch, who had lost many of his friends to the plague, expressed deep disillusionment with the church. He wrote, "What can the church offer us when the priests themselves fall as easily as the poor?" While many clung to their faith, others began to seek solace in different ways. Some turned to mysticism, while others sought comfort in the idea of personal salvation, rather than institutionalized religion. It was a time of spiritual upheaval and, for many, a turning point in how they saw life, death, and faith. The rise of the new class. The plague had killed many, but it had also made room for the living to rise. In the wake of the pandemic, many workers became landowners for the first time in history. Peasants who had survived the plague found that land was abundant, but labor was scarce. Landlords, desperate to find anyone who would work their fields, were forced to offer land and better conditions to those few who remained. In some regions, even the nobility was forced to adapt. The old economic system, one where wealth was inherited and power passed from generation to generation, began to fade. New wealth was earned through trade, craftsmanship, and the labor of the working class. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Bruges, this new class of merchants, bankers, and skilled laborers grew in influence, gaining power and control that had once belonged solely to the nobility. This shift in wealth and power would lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. It was the beginning of a world where social mobility, previously almost unheard of, became possible for those willing to work for it. And as more and more people began to earn their living through skill and trade, the rigid class structures of the past began to loosen. A more equal society. While the plague did open up opportunities for some, it did not lead to immediate equality. The survivors may have gained more bargaining power, but the old structures of wealth and land ownership did not disappear overnight. The nobility still held power in the courts, and land remained a source of great wealth. But, for the first time, the working class, those who had once toiled away in the background of society, began to gain a voice. They were no longer invisible. One of the most striking changes after the plague was the rise of the merchant class. Merchants, previously seen as a lower class, now gained status and wealth. In cities like Florence, they began to form powerful guilds, and they wielded influence that rivaled that of the old nobility. Money had become the new power. In fact, the rise of a more capitalistic economy driven by trade and commerce was one of the most important shifts in European history, and it would be this economy that would fuel the innovations of the Renaissance. The world begins to turn again. The world that survived the plague didn't simply come back to life, it evolved. It was like waking from a long, feverish sleep, groggy, unsure, but determined to take the first step. And so, the survivors began to rebuild, not because they had to, but because, for all its destruction, the world had left something behind, the will to live. The streets that had been empty now slowly filled again. The first signs of life were simple. A shop window opened, a cart rolling down a street. In Florence, the first bakery to open again had a small sign, "Bread for sale, no strangers." It was a cautious beginning, but it was a beginning. In some places, it was the land that first began to speak. Fields that had been left fallow began to bloom with wheat again. Farmers worked slowly, with a new respect for the soil, knowing that with each seed sown, they were not just growing crops, but hope. At first, it was a world smaller than before. People didn't travel as freely, cities remained quiet, and markets were sparse. Yet, there was a palpable sense of survival, even if it was simply in the act of planting the first crop or rebuilding a single home. Trade, like everything else, had died during the plague. Ships sat idle in harbours, their sails weathered by the wind. But slowly, new merchants began to fill the markets. Not the old ones, but new faces, younger, hungry for opportunity. In cities like Venice, the docks saw new boats unloading goods from the east and the south. Silk, spices, and glass, once symbols of wealth, now symbols of survival. In London, a new market sprung up, filled with small traders, artisans, and workers who had once been forgotten. The Black Death had shaken the foundations of the old aristocracy, and though the rich still held their land, the merchants, bankers, and artisans who survived the plague now held something more important: the future. New banking families, like the Medici in Florence, began to shape a new economy, one based not on land or birthright, but on commerce and credit. It was the beginning of what would one day become the Renaissance, an economic revolution that would shift power away from the landowners and give birth to a new kind of wealth. The rebirth wasn't just economic, it was emotional too. People had witnessed the fragility of life, and in many places, that created a deeper sense of compassion. Widows took in orphans. Farmers shared their crops with neighbours. Families who had once been scattered reunited and formed stronger ties. In some communities, people who had once been strangers, bound only by fear and suspicion, now found new solidarity. The shared trauma of the plague made them partners in survival. In Florence, a new law was passed in 1352. Those who survive must help those who remain, for we all owe life to the others. It was a simple decree, but one that reflected the new social contract survival through cooperation. This was especially true in the cities, where populations began to regrow. In Venice, families who had once been separated by class or wealth now worked together. Skilled workers found jobs in the new trades emerging from the ruins of the plague. New guilds were formed, not only to protect trade, but to build a stronger social fabric. The plague had shaken the foundations of the church. With so many clergy lost, and the faithful questioning why God had allowed such destruction, a new religious perspective emerged. Some clung tightly to the church, believing that their faith would protect them from future calamities. Others turned inward, focusing on personal salvation rather than institutional authority. Monasteries were rebuilt, but they no longer held the same dominant sway they once had. People were less likely to turn to the church for answers. Instead, a new movement was born: personal spirituality, where individuals began to seek their own paths to God, free from the structure and control of the old religious order. In some places, the mystical movements grew stronger. The Brethren of the Common Life, a group founded in the 14th century, focused on living a simple, humble life in connection with God and others. Their influence spread across Europe, leaving a lasting imprint on religious thought and practice. As the survivors built, they began to reshape not just their communities, but their vision of the future. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about living, a living that embraced the fragility of life, but also the beauty in it. People no longer took things for granted. They had learned, through loss, that every moment mattered. Love, community, work, and faith. These became the bedrock of the new world being born out of the plague's ashes. The survivors began to look forward. The old world had died, but in the quiet, in the careful rebuilding, a new world, smaller, more intimate, yet infinitely more resilient, was emerging. And though the scars of the Black Death would remain for generations, the survivors had built something stronger than what had been there before. They had built, through their shared suffering, a world that could rise again from the grief and destruction of the past. The plague had done its work. It had stripped away the old world, and in its wake, the survivors stood in a world both familiar and strange. But in that strange new world, something new began to grow: a different understanding of life, one shaped by loss, but also by a renewed sense of human connection. The old ways were gone, but a new way, quieter, more careful, had begun. The shifting foundations of faith. The church, once the bedrock of European life, had been shattered by the death toll. In some places, entire parishes had been wiped out, and priests once revered as intermediaries between heaven and earth had died alongside their flocks. But the survivors had begun to question their faith. How could God allow such destruction? Why had the clergy been struck down just as hard as the poor? Some turned toward mysticism, personal, intimate experiences, with the divine that didn't require the intercession of a priest. Others left the church altogether, searching for solace in new beliefs, in personal salvation, rather than institutionalized religion. Yet, despite this disillusionment, religion never disappeared. Instead, it transformed. People sought direct connection with the divine, rejecting the rituals and dogmas that had once defined their religious lives. The early Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch began to see faith in a more individualistic light, a reflection of the new, more self-reliant world they were building. The mystical movements grew during this period, as people began to seek deeper, more personal connections with God. In Germany, the Brethren of the Common Life focused on personal piety and simplicity, choosing humility and meditation over wealth and power. This shift laid the groundwork for the Reformation, which would soon follow in the 16th century, reshaping Christianity as a whole. Art and literature after the plague. Before the plague, art had been primarily concerned with the divine, the saints, the heavens, the eternal glory of God. But after the Black Death, artists began to focus on the human condition. The starkness of death had made life feel more precious, and as a result, artists and writers turned their attention inward. The theme of impermanence became central to art and literature. The danse macabre, dance of death, emerged as a powerful symbol depicting people from all walks of life, dancing with skeletons, a reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. Painters like Giotto and Ambrogio Lorenzetti began to depict death and decay with unflinching honesty, giving their works a haunting yet deeply human quality. In literature, the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio explored human resilience in the face of disaster. The tales told by the young people who fled the plague in Florence were filled with wit, humour, and a deep appreciation for life, despite the world around them crumbling. This shift in focus from the divine to the human was pivotal in the Renaissance, when artists would begin to celebrate human achievement and individuality. The Black Death had not only reshaped faith, but it had also shaped how people viewed themselves, their bodies, and their potential. The economic rebirth. The plague had wiped out so many, and with it, had radically altered the economic landscape. The population had shrunk, and the balance of power had shifted. Land was abundant, but labour was scarce, and for the first time, the working class had real bargaining power. Peasants demanded more for their work, and wages soared. In Italy, a new class of merchants and bankers emerged. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa began to thrive, not on the old land-based wealth, but on trade, banking, and skilled craftsmanship. The Medici family, who had made their fortune through banking, would go on to become one of the most influential families in Europe, laying the foundations for the Renaissance. It was a time of economic innovation, one that encouraged the rise of capitalism and banking systems that would power the modern world. The old feudal system, based on land ownership and agrarian wealth, began to fade as new wealth emerged from trade, manufacturing, and financial systems. Money began to speak louder than birthright. Power shifted from the lords and kings to the merchants and financiers. The groundwork for the modern economy had been laid. The human legacy. In the end, the Black Death did more than just decimate Europe's population. It reshaped humanity's entire worldview. The plague had forced people to confront their own mortality in a way they never had before. It had taken away the old certainties, and in their place had created a new kind of resilience, one born of necessity and born of shared suffering. The survivors had learned the fragility of life, and they had learned to embrace it. They celebrated survival, not just the physical act of living, but the very fact that they could continue to feel, to love, to create in the wake of such devastation. This was a generation that had learned the value of community, compassion, and resilience. And so, in the aftermath of one of the darkest moments in human history, the survivors began to build a world that was smaller, but also kinder. They began to cherish life and each other in a way they had never done before. The Black Death may have destroyed much, but it also planted the seeds for the Renaissance, a rebirth of culture, art, and human potential. From the ashes of death, humanity would rise not to rebuild the old world, but to create a new one. A world that would carry the memory of the past, but look forward to the future with renewed hope. The rise of the Renaissance. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was one forever changed. The Great Plague had ravaged the population, stripping away entire communities, and yet, from the ashes of this destruction, a new world began to take shape. The survivors, the ones who had been forced to reckon with mortality in such a profound way, began to search for meaning not just in religion, but in themselves. In the quiet that followed the plague, a new curiosity was born. A curiosity about the human condition, about the world, and about what it meant to live and create in the face of death. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, the rebirth of humanism, a shift from a world dominated by religious thought to one where individualism, art, and science began to take center stage. But how did it all begin? How did a world, shaken by death and loss, find the strength to rebuild? The humanist movement. It began, in part, with the humanist movement a deep interest in the individual, in human potential, and in the idea that humans, not just the divine, had the power to shape their own destiny. Before the plague, the Church had dominated European life. But after the plague, there was a palpable shift. The survivors, having witnessed the fragile nature of life, began to wonder, what does it mean to be human? What is our role on this earth? Scholars like Francesco Petrarch, often considered the father of Renaissance humanism, began to re-examine ancient texts, particularly those of the classical world. The works of Homer, Virgil, and Plato, once preserved in the monasteries, now became the focal point of a new intellectual movement. Petrarch's obsession with ancient wisdom and personal reflection inspired many, and his work ignited a spark that would influence generations of artists, writers, and thinkers across Europe. Humanism was about more than just study. It was about engagement with the world, a recognition that life was fleeting and therefore worth living to the fullest. It was this belief that fueled the Renaissance, turning artists and thinkers toward human-centered creation and away from the purely divine-focused art of the Middle Ages. The birth of Renaissance art. Art, which had long been dominated by religious themes, began to shift as well. Painters, sculptors, and architects who had once created to honor the divine now began to explore human subjects, emotions, and experiences. The work of Giotto, Donatello, and Leonardo da Vinci epitomized this new approach to art, focusing on the realism of the human form and the emotional depth of the human soul. The works produced during this time were not just about religious figures or biblical scenes, they were about humans as individuals. Giotto's frescoes, for example, brought emotion into the forefront, allowing the viewer to experience the human story, not just the divine. Donatello's sculptures of David and Mary Magdalene broke new ground by emphasizing human expression and individual form, moving away from the idealized representations of the past. The shift in art also coincided with a rise in architecture. Grand cathedrals and buildings gave way to more human-scaled, accessible structures that reflected the changes in society. The Florence Cathedral, with its iconic dome, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, stood as a testament to the growing confidence in human skill and knowledge. In the wake of the plague, the demand for religious imagery slowly faded. Instead, a new genre of art began to emerge: human-centered art. The Renaissance artists were inspired by the idea that human life, with all its flaws and beauty, was worth exploring and celebrating. The human form was no longer just a vessel for divine beings. It was celebrated as an object of beauty and a subject of intellectual study. The influence of the ancient Greeks and Romans played a key role in this transformation. Artists like Donatello and Michelangelo took inspiration from the classical sculptures of ancient Rome, which emphasized the realism of the human body. Michelangelo's statue of David, one of the greatest masterpieces of the Renaissance, embodied this new approach. The David was not just a biblical figure, it was a symbol of human strength, defiance, and individual will. For the first time, the human figure in art was not just a servant of the divine, but a representation of human dignity and potential. Additionally, the use of perspective in painting was developed, which completely changed the way space was depicted in art. Filippo Brunelleschi, an architect and engineer, is credited with developing the technique of linear perspective, which allowed artists to create a more realistic portrayal of the world. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael used this newfound technique to create stunningly realistic scenes, drawing viewers into their works in ways never seen before. Art was no longer just decoration. It became a vehicle for expressing new ideals about the individual, human potential, and the world. The rise of science and inquiry. As the Renaissance flourished, so too did the pursuit of knowledge and scientific inquiry. The humanist belief in the potential of human reason and the focus on individual experience laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Nicolaus Copernicus, who would challenge the long-held beliefs of the cosmos, and Leonardo da Vinci, who sketched designs for flying machines, were not just responding to a world in crisis, they were seeking to shape a new world, one based on observation, questioning, and reason. For the first time, the scientific method, experimentation, observation, and reasoning began to replace reliance on religious doctrine. The Renaissance was a time when knowledge was not just an act of faith, but an act of human endeavor, and this belief in human ingenuity would come to define the coming centuries. A shift in society and power. The economic systems of the medieval world were gone, replaced by new structures based on trade, banking, and capital. The Medici family in Florence, who had risen to power through banking, would become one of the wealthiest and most influential families in European history. Their wealth allowed them to patronize the arts, which in turn allowed artists and intellectuals to flourish in a way never seen before. But the social shift was even deeper. The old feudal system, in which lords and peasants were rigidly separated, began to fade. The middle class, made up of merchants, bankers, and craftsmen, grew in influence. People who had once lived as peasants in the fields now had the power to shape their own future. Society became more fluid, more open to mobility and change, a dramatic departure from the rigid social hierarchy of the medieval era. The Renaissance's enduring legacy. The Renaissance did not just change Europe, it changed the world. It marked a shift from darkness to light, from medieval piety to a celebration of human achievement, from a world focused on survival to one focused on growth and creativity. In art, literature, and science, the Renaissance laid the groundwork for the modern world. It was the beginning of a new age of exploration, a world where ideas could flow freely, where knowledge was accessible, and where individuals began to take ownership of their own destiny. From the ashes of the plague, Europe had risen, not only surviving, but transforming itself into a place where the human spirit, once constrained by fear and loss, could soar. And as the Renaissance flourished, so did the knowledge that no plague, no matter how devastating, could ever truly stop the movement of human progress. In the hearts and minds of those who had lived through the darkness, the light of the Renaissance burned brighter than ever before. The Reformation and the end of the medieval mindset, the Black Death, left an indelible scar on Europe. Its death toll was staggering, and its impact was felt not only in the bodies it took, but in the very soul of European society. People, having witnessed so much suffering, began to question. They asked themselves why. Why did the plague strike down so many, leaving entire villages abandoned? Why had God allowed this suffering, this mass death? For centuries, the Church had been the guiding light for the faithful, the intermediary between man and God. But the great tragedy of the Black Death shattered that trust. If the priests, the holy men, who were supposed to have a divine connection, could fall victim to the plague just as easily as the poor, then what did that mean for the promises of salvation? This was a moment of profound spiritual crisis. The crisis of faith. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed a fundamental belief system. For many, faith in the Church and its authority had been the cornerstone of their world. But after the plague, faith was no longer something that could be taken for granted. As villages emptied and families were torn apart, people turned inward and began to question the teachings of the Catholic Church. The Church had long promised that faithful adherence to its doctrines would ensure eternal life, that good deeds would be rewarded, and that the priesthood held the key to salvation. Yet, in the face of overwhelming death, these promises seemed empty. If the Church had no power to stop the plague, if the clergy were no more immune to death than the peasants, then what exactly had they been serving? This disillusionment with the Church's authority, especially its inability to save its own flock, began to sow the seeds of rebellion. Petrarch, a humanist thinker, had already expressed his dissatisfaction with the Church long before the plague, but the devastation of the Black Death only fueled that dissatisfaction further. He and others began to question the institutional power that had been established by the Church, and in doing so, they laid the intellectual foundation for a religious transformation. The seeds of Reformation. Martin Luther's challenge. It was not long before these questions took root in the hearts and minds of individuals across Europe. A generation who had seen the fragility of life, who had survived an event that seemed both divine and devastating, began to seek new answers. The Reformation, though it would not come until a century after the Black Death, was already being prepared by the questioning of church authority and a growing desire for religious reform. One man in particular would be at the center of this change. Martin Luther, a monk, had studied the Bible extensively and had come to believe that the church was corrupt. His 95 Theses, nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517, was a direct challenge to the church's authority, particularly over indulgences, the practice of selling absolution from sin. For Luther, the idea that salvation could be bought was a blasphemous perversion of Christianity, and it was this belief, alongside his growing disillusionment with the church's influence over people's spiritual lives, that led him to call for reform. But the intellectual groundwork for the Reformation had already been laid. Luther's questions echoed a larger, widespread frustration with the Catholic Church that had been growing for decades, especially after the Black Death. The plague had left many with a sense that life and faith could no longer be treated as static, unquestioned absolutes. The rise of humanism and the Renaissance had already begun shifting people's thinking from a rigid, faith-based understanding of the world to one that embraced individual experience, learning, and interpretation. This intellectual current would help fuel Luther's message, which rejected the idea that salvation came through the church alone and promoted the idea of personal relationship with God. The fall of church authority. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the pillar of European society. It held power not only over religious matters, but also over political and social life. But after the Black Death, its authority began to unravel. More and more people, struggling to make sense of their losses, began to look for alternative paths to salvation and spiritual fulfillment. As Luther's ideas spread, many secular rulers began to see the Reformation as a way to assert independence from the papacy and church influence. They saw an opportunity to challenge the political power of the Pope and to claim a greater stake in the religious lives of their subjects. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, would later seek to suppress the Reformation. But by the time Luther's ideas had taken root, the Protestant Reformation was unstoppable. The Church's power, which had seemed unassailable, was now being challenged from within. And in the wake of the plague's devastation, there was a willingness to listen to new ideas, to break free from the medieval mindset that had once dominated the hearts and minds of so many. The spread of Reformation ideas. Luther's ideas spread rapidly across Europe, in part thanks to the printing press, which had been invented just decades earlier. Books and pamphlets circulated widely, and Luther's translation of the Bible into German made the sacred text accessible to ordinary people. This was a revolutionary moment for the first time. People could read the Bible in their own language, without the need for a priest to interpret it for them. The idea that individuals could read and interpret the Bible for themselves directly challenged the authority of the Church, which had long controlled access to Scripture. Luther's message resonated with the common people, who, after the ravages of the plague, were more receptive to messages of self-determination and personal faith. This was a cultural shift from an external, hierarchical system of salvation controlled by the clergy to a more personal, direct relationship with the divine. This ideological shift also led to the formation of new Protestant sects throughout Europe, from the Lutherans in Germany to the Calvinists in France and Switzerland, and the Anglicans in England. Each of these movements sought to strip away what they saw as the corruption of the Catholic Church and to return to a more biblically grounded faith. The end of the medieval mindset. The Reformation was not just a religious movement, it was a social and cultural revolution. It marked the end of the medieval mindset, one that viewed the world through the lens of feudalism, church authority, and a static view of reality. The Reformation, fueled in part by the widespread doubts and frustrations born from the Black Death, helped to create a world that was more open to questioning, more willing to embrace individuality, and more focused on personal experience and personal responsibility. This shift in thinking would have profound consequences for the development of modern Western thought, laying the foundation for Enlightenment thinking, the rise of democracy, and a new approach to science, art, and politics. The world had changed, and it had changed because people had begun to question everything. A world transformed, the global impact. The Black Death was not just a European tragedy. Its tendrils reached far beyond the shores of the Mediterranean, stretching across continents and affecting people and societies in places many could never have imagined. The plague was, in many ways, a global event, an epidemic that reshaped the world's geography, trade routes, and populations. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, it set off a chain reaction that would impact Asia, Africa, and eventually the New World. The plague's journey east, from Europe to Asia. While Europe bore the brunt of the plague, it wasn't long before the disease began to spread to other parts of the world. In fact, it is believed that the Black Death originated in Central Asia, where it spread along the Silk Road, carried by traders and migrants. By the time the disease reached the Middle East and North Africa, it had already taken root in large parts of Asia. In China, the city of Kambalik, modern-day Beijing, was devastated by the plague, with millions perishing. The movement of goods along trade routes, particularly those used by merchants in the Mongol Empire, inadvertently carried the plague to new places. The Mongol Empire, which had established a vast network of trade and communication, was in many ways a double-edged sword, providing an efficient method for the plague to travel. However, the same trade routes that carried the disease also spread cultural knowledge, and despite the death toll, these interactions shaped the future of cross-continental exchanges. The impact on Africa, the plague's shadow on the continent. In Africa, the Black Death's impact was felt less directly, but still profound. The Mediterranean trade routes that connected Europe and Africa became unpredictable, with many merchant caravans abandoning long-standing routes in the wake of the plague. The fear of contagion and the breakdown of trade disrupted the usual flow of goods from gold, ivory, and slaves to textiles and spices. In North Africa, cities like Cairo and Alexandria became particularly affected, as they were key centers of trade and learning in the Arab world. Historians note that the plague reduced Egypt's population drastically and deeply affected Islamic scholarship. Islamic scholars, who had long been engaged in scientific and philosophical studies, found their universities and libraries empty, and the social fabric of the region was torn apart by the loss of life. Despite these challenges, Africa's trade networks slowly began to reorient over time, looking toward other markets, including those along the trans-Saharan routes, which would later play an essential role in sub-Saharan Africa's economic revival. Africa and the creation of new trade networks. While the plague ravaged certain parts of Africa, it also led to the development of new trade networks. By the time the Black Death's effects had faded in Europe, Africa's long-standing trans-Saharan trade routes became more important than ever. Northern Africa increasingly became a key player in the Atlantic slave trade, with merchants bringing enslaved individuals to both the Middle East and the Americas, a trade that would explode in the centuries to come. As Europe turned inward after the plague, its focus shifted toward recovering from the devastation of its population, while Africa and other parts of the world started to rediscover and fortify their own trade systems, marking a shift in global trade dynamics. The spread of the Black Death to the Americas. An indirect journey. Interestingly, while the Black Death itself did not directly reach the Americas, its global impacts nonetheless created an indirect path that would eventually reach the New World. By 1492, when Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World, the legacy of the plague had already set the stage for an era of exploration and colonization. The age of exploration that followed the plague's devastation was shaped by many factors, but one of the most important was the shift in the global balance of power. As Europe struggled to recover from the plague, its explorers set their sights on the Americas, seeking new territories and wealth in the wake of the collapse of many old world systems. The rise of global trade and the expansion of empires. The Black Death was not just a devastating blow to the populations of Europe and Asia, it also fundamentally reshaped the global economy. In the aftermath of the plague, as Europe began to recover, the demand for goods surged. People who had survived the pandemic sought to rebuild, and trade became essential to the recovery process. This renewed demand for goods from food, textiles, spices, and luxury items paved the way for the rise of global trade networks that spanned continents. The expansion of trade had already been underway before the plague, with the Silk Road connecting the East to the West. But after the Black Death, the need for resources and the desire for wealth spurred European exploration and expansion. The Venetians, Genoese, and Portuguese became key players in this new era of trade, leveraging their naval power and merchant networks to establish new trade routes. These maritime republics were able to control access to the Mediterranean and Asian markets, fostering a global exchange of goods and ideas. One of the most important results of the plague was the expansion of European imperialism. Countries like Spain and Portugal, now recovering from the economic devastation, began to explore new lands, hoping to find gold, spices, and new trade partners. The famous voyages of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama would lead to the establishment of colonial empires and the eventual integration of the Americas into the global trade network. In Africa, the Portuguese, for example, began to establish trading posts along the coast. This period marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, as the need for labor in European colonies grew and enslaved people were brought to the New World to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. The rise of global trade was thus not just about exchanging goods, but also about expanding the global labor market with all its complex and tragic consequences. By the 16th century, global empires were forming, driven by the desire for resources and profit. This new imperialism and the rise of mercantilism began to shape the geopolitical landscape of the world for centuries to come. A new era of migration and cultural exchange. In the wake of the Black Death, one of the most significant and long-lasting consequences was a mass migration of people. The plague had decimated entire populations, leaving vacant lands, abandoned cities, and empty villages. This disruption to the traditional way of life forced many to migrate in search of better opportunities, safety, and new beginnings. The labor shortage in Europe opened up new opportunities for the survivors, both within Europe and abroad. For example, as agriculture became increasingly mechanized and more efficient, many people left rural areas in search of work in growing cities. The growth of urban centers throughout Europe became a major feature of the post-plague world, as cities like London, Paris, and Florence expanded rapidly. But migration was not limited to internal movement. It was also a key element in the exchange of cultures and ideas. The rediscovery of ancient Roman and Greek texts during the Renaissance led to a greater interest in learning and the sharing of knowledge between different cultures. The movement of scholars, philosophers, and merchants across Europe helped establish connections between different regions, creating new intellectual and cultural networks. At the same time, the rise of European colonization led to increased global migration, particularly as Europeans moved to the New World. The Columbian Exchange, which brought plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds, also brought peoples together in the form of settlers, traders, and eventually enslaved populations. This migration was often forced, as in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, but it also led to cultural exchanges that had lasting impacts on the global identity of the Americas and Europe. Cultural exchange, while at times violent and exploitative, also led to the blending of traditions. Foods, music, art, and languages were exchanged in ways that enriched societies on both sides of the Atlantic, creating a more interconnected world. A changed world, new connections, new opportunities. The Black Death, in many ways, set the stage for the globalization of the world. The vast disruptions caused by the plague were not merely negative. They created new opportunities and connections that would change the world forever. As populations began to rebuild, the human drive to survive and thrive led to the development of new economic systems, new forms of governance, and new forms of intercontinental interaction. The plague accelerated the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and isolated economies, began to give way to a more dynamic global economy. Europe's need to recover from the effects of the plague and its desire to expand its influence led to the rise of mercantile empires, nations that sought to control trade and resources across vast distances. The discovery of the New World in the late 15th century opened up a whole new set of global opportunities for Europeans. The establishment of colonies, the development of the transatlantic slave trade, and the exploitation of resources in the Americas brought immense wealth to European empires. This wealth fueled further expansion, both in terms of territory and knowledge. New inventions in navigation, like the compass and the astrolabe, made it possible to explore further and faster, connecting parts of the world that had once been isolated. Trade routes that had once been confined to the Mediterranean began to extend to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, creating a global network of trade, politics, and culture. The Ottoman Empire, Ming China, and Spanish and Portuguese empires became powerful players in this new global order, each vying for control of trade routes, resources, and territories. The world was now more connected than ever before, and the Black Death, while a devastating loss, helped usher in a new era of opportunity. It set the stage for the age of exploration, where commerce, ideas, and people would move across the globe in ways never seen before. Humanity after the Black Death. The Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, a catastrophe that shook the foundations of life itself. But it also became a moment in history when humanity was forced to reckon with its own mortality. The survivors of the plague, standing in the wreckage of a world that had once been familiar, now looked at life differently. What was it that made life worth living? What did it mean to survive? And how had society so deeply entrenched in tradition and religion changed in the face of such profound suffering? The human condition, a changed perspective. Before the Black Death, life in medieval Europe was shaped by clear and rigid social, religious, and political systems. The medieval mindset was grounded in the belief that life was fated, governed by a divine order. People believed that their social position, whether they were noble, peasant, or serf, was part of God's will. This belief in divine providence provided comfort to many, for it suggested that human life was controlled by a higher power, and that suffering and death had a purpose, a test, or a punishment for one's sins. But the arrival of the Black Death shook this worldview to its core. The plague did not discriminate. It ravaged the rich, the poor, the clergy, and the laypeople. For the first time, people began to realize that life was fragile, that the structures that had provided meaning and stability, whether it was social rank, wealth, or religious devotion, could be shattered in an instant. What was the point of rigid systems of class if a plague could sweep through and take anyone, regardless of their status? What did faith matter if the priests, those closest to God, died just like the rest of the population. This realization marked a dramatic shift in how people viewed the human condition. No longer did they see life as something fixed or predestined. The plague forced people to confront the uncertainty of existence in a way they had never been forced to before. If life was so uncertain, what could they do to find meaning in their fleeting existence? For the survivors, the value of life became more personal and immediate. Instead of focusing on what might come after death, many began to focus more on how to live in the moment, to make the most of what little time they had left. This newfound awareness of mortality led to a greater appreciation for the here and now, for the simple joys of living, loving, and creating. The human condition was no longer something passive to be endured, but something active to be embraced and cherished. Art, literature, and philosophy, in the wake of the plague, began to reflect this new understanding, celebrating life, even in its fragility. The new attitude toward death. The Black Death irrevocably altered the way people thought about death. Before the plague, death was a concept deeply embedded in the religious and cultural understanding of life. It was accepted as a part of life inevitable, predictable, and even ritualized. People had learned to live with the idea of death, understanding it as something they could prepare for through faith, penance, and good work. But the scale of the Black Death was so overwhelming, so random, that it shattered the traditional view of death. Unlike in previous generations, when death was seen as the natural endpoint of life, the plague made death seem arbitrary, something that could strike at any moment, without warning, and often for reasons no one could understand. Death was no longer a distant possibility, but a present, looming threat, claiming entire families, villages, and even cities in a matter of days. The randomness of the plague's toll created a new attitude toward death, an acceptance of its inevitability, but also a rejection of its dominance. Where death had once been seen as a mystical part of God's plan, it now became something more real, more immediate, and less easily understood. As priests and nobles died alongside peasants, the idea of salvation through church rituals became less convincing. Why, people asked, would the church not protect them? If the faithful could perish so easily, did the old system of religious salvation still have meaning? As people were forced to confront death in its most raw and unforgiving form, many began to seek other ways to deal with it. The church, with all its teachings about the afterlife and salvation, no longer had the same power to comfort people in their suffering. This led to a shift toward personal spirituality. Instead of relying on the intermediaries of priests and the church, more and more people began to seek direct experiences with the divine. Mysticism flourished the belief that individuals could commune with God on their own terms without the need for institutionalized rituals. The personal relationship with God became central to the faith of many survivors, who felt that direct access to the divine could provide the only meaning in a world turned upside down by death. Philosophers, poets, and writers began to reflect these new attitudes in their works. In the wake of the Black Death, many writers began to focus on the uncertainty of life and the impermanence of death. Giovanni Boccaccio, for example, wrote his famous Decameron, a series of stories about young people who flee the plague in Florence and seek solace in companionship and storytelling. In these tales, the theme of human resilience in the face of death is prominent, as the characters find ways to survive both physically and emotionally. Ultimately, the Black Death led to a transformation in people's relationship with death. Rather than seeing it as a distant inevitability, death was now a force that could strike without warning. This awareness brought both fear and freedom. People, aware of the fragility of life, began to place more value on the present, on connection, and on making their lives matter in the time they had. Death, which once defined human life as something to be feared and prepared for, now became a reminder to live fully, even in a world filled with uncertainty. It was no longer something to be passively endured. It was something to be confronted and understood as part of the broader human experience. In the wake of the Black Death, the human condition was no longer defined by a belief in fate or destiny, but by a recognition of individual agency. The plague taught humanity that life could be shattered in an instant, but it also showed that resilience, creativity, and human connection could bring us back from the brink. The new attitude toward death, one of awareness, acceptance, and action, shaped how people lived in the centuries that followed. It was a reminder that life, even in its fragility, is something to be valued, cherished, and lived to the fullest. The legacy of survival, social and psychological shifts. For those who survived, the plague became more than just a physical event. It was a psychological turning point. Survivors were left to grapple with a new reality, a world where so many had fallen and so few remained. There was a new psychological awareness that life could end at any moment, and with that awareness came a deeper appreciation for life itself. The idea of survival took on a new meaning. To live after the Black Death was not just to be alive, but to be part of something much greater, the rebuilding of a world. People began to cherish family and community in ways they had never done before. The plague had torn apart families, but in the aftermath, there was an increased emphasis on building and sustaining close-knit communities. A new social contract emerged: mutual aid, compassion, and cooperation became more than just moral ideals. They were survival strategies. In cities and villages across Europe, people formed social pacts, mutual support systems, and communal efforts to rebuild what had been lost. In many ways, the plague left behind a legacy of resilience. The survivors of the Black Death learned that the world could be destroyed in an instant, but it could also be rebuilt. They learned to value their lives in a way that had never been possible before, for they had seen what could be lost. The transformation of society, a new social order. Before the Black Death, Europe was a land divided by rigid social hierarchies. The feudal system, with its clear distinctions between lords, vassals, serfs, and peasants, dominated life across the continent. Life was dictated by birthright, and one's position in society was almost entirely determined by lineage, wealth, and land ownership. But the plague changed all of that. With the death of so many, the old social order began to break down. Entire communities were lost, and the labor force was decimated. In the immediate aftermath, those who remained found themselves with new power, particularly the peasants and laborers who had long been at the mercy of the elite. Suddenly, there were fewer workers to tend the land, build the cities, and keep the economy running, and this imbalance led to significant changes in the power structure. One of the most significant shifts was in wages. Before the plague, peasants had worked for meagre wages, often bound by feudal obligations and living in poverty. But after the plague, the supply of labor had dwindled, and those who remained had newfound bargaining power. In some regions, wages doubled or tripled. Workers could demand better working conditions, and in many cases, they did. Peasants began to leave their lands in search of better opportunities, and the very nature of labor relations was transformed. The feudal system, which had kept people trapped in their social positions for centuries, began to lose its grip. For the first time, social mobility became a real possibility. The idea that a person could rise above their birthright through their own skill or labor began to take shape. Artisans, traders, and merchants, once seen as secondary to the aristocracy, started to gain more economic power, while nobles began to find their influence waning. In some cases, even the nobility had to adapt. The old aristocracy, which had lived off the labor of the peasantry, found that their wealth was no longer as secure. The rise of commerce and banking opened up opportunities for new classes to emerge, and money began to speak louder than birthright. The legacy of the Black Death. Lessons learned. The Black Death was, without a doubt, one of the most devastating events in human history. It left behind a trail of death and despair that would shape Europe and the world for centuries. Yet, from the ashes of this calamity, humanity learned valuable lessons about life, death, and the human condition. One of the most profound lessons was about the fragility of life. Before the plague, many people lived under the assumption that life followed a predictable course: birth, marriage, work, and eventually death, all shaped by religion and tradition. But after the plague, people realized just how quickly life could be taken away. The sheer randomness of death, and the fact that the wealthy and the powerful could be as vulnerable as the poor, shook people's faith in the idea that life was fated. This led to a shift in attitudes toward death and the afterlife. No longer could people rely on the church to provide certainty about their place in heaven. Instead, many turned inward, seeking personal salvation through direct experiences of faith. There was a rise in mysticism, the idea that individuals could find a personal relationship with the divine without the need for institutional mediation. On a broader scale, the Black Death accelerated the decline of the medieval mindset and laid the groundwork for the emergence of Renaissance humanism. As people grappled with the enormity of death, they began to look for meaning within themselves and in the world around them, rather than relying on divine intervention. Humanism emphasized the importance of individual experience, reason, and creativity, and these values would lay the foundation for the cultural and intellectual revolution that would follow in the coming centuries. The plague also taught humanity about the importance of community and cooperation. In the aftermath of the devastation, survivors realized that mutual aid was essential for survival. In villages and towns, people formed new bonds, working together to rebuild what had been lost. The emphasis shifted from individual survival to shared survival, a lesson that would shape social and political movements in the centuries to come. And yet, while the plague shattered many old beliefs, it also reinforced certain human truths. One of the most important lessons was the value of life itself. In a world where death was so prevalent, the survivors learned to cherish every moment, every breath, and every relationship. They found new appreciation for family, friendship, and love values that would become central to the human experience going forward. The Black Death also forced people to question authority in new ways. In the years following the plague, the power of the church began to wane. People, disillusioned by the church's inability to protect them from the plague, began to seek answers elsewhere. This shift in faith would lead to the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism, which would forever change the course of religious history. Finally, the most lasting legacy of the Black Death was the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the incredible loss, the survivors of the plague showed an astonishing capacity for recovery. They rebuilt their societies, rediscovered their creativity, and began to live in a way that acknowledged the uncertainty of life while still embracing its beauty. A world forever changed. As we look back over the past hours, the journey we've taken together through time, across continents, through tragedy, and eventual rebirth, we begin to realize just how deeply the Black Death changed our world. It was more than just a disease. It was the turning point that forced humanity to face its own mortality and question everything it had long held true. From the ashes of despair, new ideas, new social structures, and a renewed sense of individual responsibility began to emerge. The plague reshaped religion, art, society, and economics, not just in Europe, but across the globe. In the wake of the devastation, we learned one simple, yet profound truth. Life is fragile, and every moment matters. The survivors of the Black Death did more than rebuild, they reshaped the future. They taught us that even after the most destructive of forces, humanity has the resilience to survive, to adapt, and to flourish once more. So, what does all of this mean for us today? The lessons of the Black Death are not just about history. They are a reminder of our own fragility and our ability to overcome even the darkest times. In our lives, we face challenges, we experience loss, but like those who lived through the plague, we are reminded that resilience is what defines us. In times of despair, community, compassion, and human creativity are what keep us moving forward. Just like the survivors of the Black Death, we have the power to shape our future, no matter what challenges we face. If you've made it this far in the video, I want to thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with others who may need a reminder of the strength of the human spirit. And of course, if you want to continue exploring more untold stories from history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. By doing so, you'll never miss an episode of our deep dives into the past, exploring how it shapes our present and future. Once again, thank you for watching. Remember, every moment counts, and every story has the power to change us.